There is a spiritual deception that has quietly stolen the peace of countless faithful Catholics once they cross the threshold of 70 years of age. The greatest tragedy is that most of them never even recognize it. They genuinely believe they are carrying a cross given to them by God. But in reality, they are crushing themselves beneath weights that slowly fill the heart with fear, false guilt, spiritual exhaustion, and eventually despair. This is exactly how the enemy operates in spiritual warfare. He rarely asks a devout Christian, someone who has lived the faith their entire life, to completely abandon God. He is far more cunning than that. He simply convinces them to carry heavy burdens that God never asked them to carry. St. Padre Pio spent his entire priesthood calling souls back to absolute trust in God's mercy, warning them against becoming slaves to fear and scrupulosity in their spiritual lives. So let me ask you a question. What if one of those unnecessary burdens has been secretly shaping your prayer life for years? What if every night you go to bed believing that God expected more from your prayers, when in reality He was inviting you to lay a heavy burden down? Today, we are going to expose a massive spiritual weight that quietly imprisons countless older believers, a deception directly tied to your prayer life after the age of 70. As the wrinkles deepen around your eyes and your body no longer possesses the physical strength to kneel for hours before the Blessed Sacrament like it did in your youth, the enemy begins to sow seeds of doubt. He whispers into your mind, "Your soul is growing cold. You are not praying enough rosaries. Your constant distractions are ruining your prayers. You are no longer pleasing to God like you used to be." This is exactly where the demonic deception takes its deepest root. We mistakenly equate the natural, physical exhaustion of the aging body with the spiritual decline of the soul. Most people never recognize this trap. Many will carry this illogical burden of guilt until their final breath. But when you truly understand what church teaching and moral theology actually say, you will realize why Christ never intended for you to live beneath such an exhausting weight. Why does God seem to demand something different from our prayers after the age of 70? What actually changes? The answer is the soul itself. As the decades pass, heaven begins teaching profound lessons that youth can never fully comprehend. These are spiritual truths that can only be absorbed after a lifetime of spiritual battles, victories, failures, painful losses, and faithful perseverance. Physical strength inevitably fades. Daily life becomes slower and increasingly limited. Yet the virtue of trust has the opportunity to grow far beyond anything we experienced in our earlier years. Padre Pio never believed that the later years of life were the end of a soul's usefulness. He knew that these years were often the beginning of a soul's deepest and most quiet union with Christ. Your prayer life is not fading away. Rather, God is demanding that it become profoundly deeper. For decades, your spiritual life was likely defined by action and exertion. You attended multiple masses, you served your parish, you knelt on hard wooden kneelers for holy hours, and you recited novenas with sharp, unbroken focus. That was the season of active spiritual labor. But as the body ages, God in His infinite wisdom and divine providence initiates a profound shift. According to traditional Catholic moral theology and the teachings of the great mystics of the Church, this shift is not a punishment for your physical decline. It is a divine invitation to passive purification. Yet, how does the enemy twist this beautiful, sacred invitation? He weaponizes your physical limitations against your peace of mind. When arthritis prevents you from kneeling, the demonic realm whispers that you are being disrespectful to the Blessed Sacrament. When cognitive fatigue causes your mind to wander during the rosary, the enemy accuses you of spiritual laziness. He wants you to remain trapped in the exhausting belief that the value of your prayer is measured strictly by your physical endurance or the sheer volume of words you can produce. St. Thomas Aquinas teaches us in the Summa Theologica that the essence of virtue is found in the interior disposition of the will, not merely in the exterior exertion of the body. What God demands of your prayer after 70 is not a marathon of vocal prayers, but the profound, quiet surrender of your will. The great deception lies in the modern, overly activist mindset that doing is always superior to simply being in the presence of God. Think of the times you have sat in your armchair, perhaps too tired or in too much physical pain to form the words of a formal prayer, simply holding your rosary while your heart quietly ached for God. The enemy tells you this is a wasted hour. He calls it sloth. But sacred tradition tells us something entirely different. This is often the threshold of contemplative prayer. It is the sacred moment when human effort ceases, allowing divine grace to take over the heavy lifting. God is intentionally stripping away your reliance on your own physical and mental strength so that He Himself can become your sole support. The burden you must violently reject and lay down is the false guilt of not praying exactly as you did at age 30 or 40. Continuing to carry that guilt is actually a subtle form of spiritual pride. It is the unspoken belief that your prayers were effective in the past because of your intense effort rather than God's unmerited grace. As you enter the later stages of life, Christ demands far less of your physical stamina, but He demands infinitely more of your trust. He is asking you to stop trying to earn His love through spiritual productivity and to start allowing Him to love you precisely in your poverty and weakness. When we fail to understand this theological reality, we leave the door wide open for the enemy to drain us of all spiritual joy. But the moment you recognize that your growing weakness is the exact instrument God is using to perfect your soul, the enemy's lie collapses. However, once the enemy fails to condemn you for your physical weakness, he immediately shifts his attack to a different battlefield, your mind and your past. When physical exertion in your prayer life begins to slow down, a profound silence naturally follows. But in that newly quieted life, the demonic realm launches its second wave of attack. Once the enemy realizes he can no longer condemn you for your physical limitations, he immediately shifts his crosshairs to a much more vulnerable battlefield, your mind and your memory. As you enter your 70s, your days inherently become less distracted by the heavy demands of raising a family or building a career. You sit in your quiet room to pray your rosary or to make a spiritual communion, expecting peace. Instead, your mind is suddenly flooded with the ghosts of the past. You remember the mistakes you made as a parent 30 or 40 years ago. You recall harsh words spoken to a spouse or friends who have since passed away. You vividly remember sins of your youth and seasons of spiritual lukewarmness. The enemy uses the natural biological and psychological shifts of aging the way the older mind naturally reflects backward to construct a spiritual prison. He whispers, "How can God hear your prayers when your past is so stained? Look at how distracted you are. Your prayer is worthless." He convinces you that because your mind constantly wanders to these regrets during your holy hours, your prayer is invalid, hypocritical, and offensive to God. This is one of the most dangerous burdens an older Catholic can carry. In traditional Catholic moral theology, this is recognized as the demonic affliction of scrupulosity, yet the enemy brilliantly disguises it as humility. He tells you that true repentance means you must continuously torture yourself over sins that have already been confessed and forgiven. But let us be absolutely clear. Obsessing over sins that have already been absolved in the sacrament of reconciliation is not humility. It is a grave insult to the infinite mercy of God. It is a subtle, highly dangerous form of spiritual pride where the soul quietly declares that its own sin is somehow greater than the redemptive power of Jesus Christ's blood. St. Padre Pio frequently encountered older souls trapped in this exact demonic snare. He firmly rebuked them, teaching that while voluntary distractions are a fault, the involuntary flooding of memories and anxieties is simply a heavy cross to be borne with patience. God does not demand perfect, unbroken concentration from an aging, tired mind. What He demands is the gentle, faithful effort of returning your attention to Him, even if you have to do it 100 times during a single rosary. Every time you gently turn your mind away from a painful memory and back to the crucifix, you are engaging in a profound act of spiritual warfare. That sheer act of redirecting your will pleases God infinitely more than an hour of perfect, undisturbed focus achieved in your youth. You must violently reject the burden of your past, because God is no longer asking you to remember what He has already chosen to forget. Once the enemy fails to crush you with the physical limitations of today and fails to chain you to the forgiven sins of yesterday, he will launch his final and most terrifying assault. He will project your mind into the unknown, frightening landscape of tomorrow. This is the third great burden that countless older Catholics unknowingly carry, a burden that fundamentally attacks and destroys the theological virtue of hope. It usually does not begin with a massive crisis. It begins quietly, often in the silent hours of the night. You feel an unfamiliar sharp ache in your chest. You notice your spouse's memory slipping. You look at an empty chair in your living room and suddenly realize how fast your circle of friends is shrinking. In those highly vulnerable moments, the demon of fear steps in. He begins to assault your intellect with a series of paralyzing questions. Who will take care of you when you can no longer walk? What if you lose your mind to dementia? Will you suffer a long, agonizing illness? Will you die entirely alone? You must pay close attention to what the enemy is doing here. In traditional Catholic spiritual warfare, we know that God's grace is only provided for the present moment. God gives you the exact amount of actual grace you need to carry today's cross. He does not give you the grace today for a hypothetical cross you might carry 5 years from now. Therefore, when the devil drags your imagination into a catastrophic future, he is forcing you to face a massive, terrifying cross, completely devoid of divine assistance. The result is always absolute spiritual terror, emotional exhaustion, and crushing anxiety. St. Padre Pio understood this demonic tactic intimately. He constantly warned souls that anxiety about the future is nothing more than a useless theft of today's grace. In moral theology, yielding to this kind of despairing fear is actually a subtle assault on the first commandment. When you surrender to obsessive fear about your declining health or your final years, you are essentially declaring that God's divine providence is not powerful enough to sustain you. You are secretly believing that the Good Shepherd who has faithfully carried you through 70 years of intense trials is suddenly going to abandon you at the very end of your journey. Christ specifically commanded us in the gospel, "Do not be anxious about tomorrow." This is not just a gentle, comforting suggestion, it is a strict spiritual directive. Clinging to the fear of the future is a refusal to trust. As your body weakens, God is actively dismantling your earthly securities, your physical health, your independence, your ability to control your environment. He does this not to punish you, but to force you to lean entirely upon Him. He is stripping away your profound self-reliance so that in your final years, your only remaining support is the cross of Jesus Christ. If you try to gather tomorrow's grace today, you will only taste the bitter despair of your own human frailty. You must violently reject the demon of fear and anchor your soul entirely in the sacrament of the present moment. Once we have exposed the enemy's three greatest traps for the aging soul, the demand for physical activism, the torture of scrupulosity, and the terror of tomorrow, we are left with the ultimate question. What then does God actually demand of your prayer after the age of 70? The answer is found in the highest and most difficult peak of Catholic spiritual life. He demands the prayer of holy abandonment. For most of your life, your prayers were likely defined by petitions. You asked God to protect your children, to provide for your finances, and to heal your illnesses. Petitionary prayer is good and holy, but as you enter the final chapters of your life, God is calling you to a superior form of spiritual warfare. He is asking you to transition from continually asking Him to change your circumstances to completely surrendering your human will to whatever circumstances His divine providence permits. In traditional Catholic moral theology, the great spiritual masters teach that the highest perfection of the soul consists in the absolute conformity of our will to the divine will. When you are 70 or 80 years old and your body is failing, God does not want you to offer Him your strength anymore. He wants you to offer Him your weakness. He wants you to offer Him your absolute nothingness. The enemy completely despises this form of prayer because he has no defense against it. When the devil attacks you with a sudden sharp pain in your joints or a frightening lapse in memory, his primary goal is to make you panic, complain, and lose your spiritual peace. But if, in that exact moment of physical or mental frailty, you quietly bow your head and say, "Lord, I offer this humiliation to you. May your holy will be done," you completely disarm the demonic realm. You have taken the very weapon the devil used to discourage you and turned it into an instrument of massive spiritual merit. This is what it actually means to pray without ceasing in your later years. Your prayer is no longer just the rosary beads slipping through your fingers. Your prayer becomes the very act of existing in a state of physical decline while fiercely maintaining your peace. Every ache, every moment of fatigue, and every painful loss of independence, when accepted quietly and united to the cross of Christ, becomes a highly efficacious prayer for the salvation of souls, especially the souls of your children and grandchildren. God is demanding that you stop trying to give him what you no longer have, your youth, your sharp memory, your physical endurance, and start giving him the one thing he truly desires, your unconditional trust. Look deeply at the crucifix. Christ's greatest act of redemption did not happen when he was actively preaching or performing miracles. It happened when he was nailed to a piece of wood, completely immobilized and stripped of all human capacity. That is the altar of passive purification. And that is exactly where he is inviting your soul to rest. There's another profound reality that traditional Catholic moral theology reveals about your prayer life after the age of 70. It is the difficult, often terrifying, yet profoundly holy experience of spiritual aridity. For decades, you may have experienced sensible consolations in your spiritual life. You felt a deep emotional warmth when you received Holy Communion. You felt tears prick your eyes when you meditated on the sorrowful mysteries of the Rosary. You felt a tangible, comforting sense of peace when you sat inside a quiet church. But as the years advance, those feelings frequently vanish entirely. You sit in your chair to pray, and your heart feels like a dry, barren desert. The words of the Hail Mary seem to turn to dust in your mouth. You receive the Holy Eucharist, and despite your firm intellectual belief in the real presence, you feel absolutely no emotional connection. You feel nothing but emptiness, fatigue, and a strange spiritual numbness. The enemy of your soul immediately capitalizes on this painful silence. He whispers his most devastating and discouraging lie: God has withdrawn from you. You have done something wrong. Your prayers are dead, and heaven is no longer listening to you. But what does the sacred spiritual tradition of the Church actually teach? St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, and the great mystics explain that this loss of feeling is not a punishment. It is a deliberate divine purification. In your youth, God gave you spiritual sweetness to entice you to pray, much like a mother gives a child a piece of candy to encourage them to walk. But you are no longer a spiritual infant. God is demanding that your prayer mature. He intentionally strips away the emotional consolations because he wants to see if you will love him for who he is, or if you only loved him for the sweet, comforting feelings he gave you. This is the ultimate test of the human will. When you pray the rosary without feeling a single ounce of devotion, fighting through the brain fog and the aching joints, that prayer is infinitely more meritorious than a rosary prayed in a state of emotional ecstasy. Why? Because it is an act of pure faith. It is a raw act of the will, completely detached from human self-gratification. The devil is absolutely terrified of an older Catholic soul that continues to pray in total spiritual darkness. He knows that when you sit before the Blessed Sacrament and say, Lord, I feel absolutely nothing, my body aches and my mind is tired, but I choose to love you anyway, you are crushing the head of the serpent. God is demanding that you stop relying on your emotions to validate your faith. He is stripping away your reliance on sensible consolations so that your prayer becomes an unbreakable fortress of pure, unadulterated trust. As you bravely embrace the harsh but purifying desert of spiritual aridity, the demonic realm will attempt to crush your spirit with another profound deception, the lie of absolute uselessness. Modern secular society conditions us to measure a human being's worth strictly by their physical, economic, and social productivity. Tragically, many devout older Catholics unknowingly apply this exact same materialistic standard to their own spiritual lives. When you were 40 or 50, you were perhaps a pillar of your parish. You organized events, you physically cared for your large family, you volunteered your time, and your spiritual life produced visible, tangible fruits. Now, at 75 or 80, you might find yourself confined to an armchair, unable to even drive yourself to Sunday Mass, let alone serve the church in an active physical capacity. In this quiet isolation, the devil whispers a devastating accusation into your mind. You are a burden. You are doing nothing for God anymore. Your life has lost its spiritual purpose. This is a catastrophic misunderstanding of traditional Catholic ecclesiology. According to the dogmatic theology of the mystical body of Christ, the most powerful and effective members of the Church are rarely the ones standing in the spotlight. The true spiritual powerhouse of the Catholic Church is found in the hidden, quiet, and often agonizing suffering of its elderly members who know how to unite their pain to the holy sacrifice of the Mass. God does not demand your physical labor after the age of 70. He demands your spiritual victimhood. St. Paul tells us in his letter to the Colossians that we must make up what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. When you sit in your living room, patiently enduring the humiliation of physical decline, the ache of loneliness, and the frustrating inability to be as active as you once were, you are actually performing the highest and most potent form of intercessory prayer. You are no longer just saying the prayers, you are becoming the prayer. By intentionally offering your daily physical and mental crosses for the conversion of sinners, for the holy souls in purgatory, or for the protection of your children and grandchildren who may have wandered from the faith, your hidden life becomes terrifyingly powerful to the demonic realm. The devil desperately wants you to believe you are useless so that you will waste your suffering through complaining, self-pity, and despair. But church teaching reveals that a single day of suffering, borne with silent patience and united to the Eucharist, can purchase the salvation of a soul that 1,000 brilliant sermons could never reach. You must violently reject the demonic lie of uselessness. Your final years are not a passive waiting room for death. In the eyes of heaven, if lived in total surrender to the divine will, they are the most spiritually productive and eternally consequential years of your entire earthly life. As we reach the conclusion of this spiritual examination, we must bring all of these theological truths down to the absolute reality of your daily life. We have exposed the demonic traps of physical activism, the paralyzing torture of scrupulosity, the demon of future fear, and the lie of uselessness. We have established that God no longer requires your physical strength. He now demands your absolute, unconditional trust. But the question remains, how do you practically live this out tomorrow morning when you wake up and the reality of your aging body sets in? The application of this traditional Catholic teaching requires a radical shift in your daily spiritual habits. First, you must completely stop measuring the value of your prayer life by the clock or by your physical posture. If you can no longer kneel, sit with profound interior reverence. If your mind is too tired to pray a full rosary, hold the crucifix in your hands and slowly pray a single Our Father with deliberate intention. You must learn the practice of the morning offering in its most raw form. The moment you open your eyes and feel the arthritis, the fatigue, or the loneliness, do not complain to yourself. Immediately offer to the Father, saying, Lord, I accept this cross today for the love of you and for the salvation of my family. Let your holy will be done. That single act of the will, made in the first moments of the day, is a devastating blow to the kingdom of darkness. Second, you must violently guard your intellect against the demons of the past and the future. You must force your mind to live strictly within the sacrament of the present moment. When a memory of a forgiven sin surfaces, you must instantly cut it off. Do not entertain it. Do not debate with the devil. Simply say, Jesus, I trust in your unmerited mercy, and forcefully turn your attention back to your present duties. When fear of a medical diagnosis or future suffering attacks you, remind yourself that the Good Shepherd is already waiting for you in tomorrow. He will give you the exact grace you need, but he will only give it to you when you actually arrive there. Finally, you must learn to deeply embrace the silence and the hiddenness of these later years. Look at the Blessed Virgin Mary standing at the foot of the cross. She did not preach a sermon. She did not perform a miracle. She simply stood there in silent, agonizing love, completely surrendered to the will of the Father. That is exactly what Christ is asking of you now. Growing older is not a spiritual tragedy. It is the final glorious stripping away of your ego and your self-reliance. It is the gentle hand of God preparing your soul to enter eternity, unburdened by the attachments of this passing world. If this teaching has helped to lift a heavy burden from your soul, do not let the enemy steal this peace from you again. Make a public act of the will right now. Write in the comments, Lord, I surrender my final years entirely to your holy will. And if you know another Catholic who is carrying the crushing weight of false guilt and fear as they grow older, share this message with them. It may be the exact grace God intends to use to set them free. Remember, the Lord does not love you because you are useful. He loves you because you are His. Keep your eyes firmly fixed on the crucifix. Lay down the burdens He never asked you to carry, and allow His mercy to carry you home. May God bless you, and may He grant you profound, unshakable peace.